Chains rattled softly through the damp stone halls of the Carthage prison as two women were led into the darkest depths of the Roman Empire's dungeons. One belonged to nobility, the other to servitude. One held a newborn child close to her chest. The other carried an unborn child within her. They were bound by something Rome feared more than any blade: the Christian faith. In the year 203 AD, Perpetua and Felicitas would be condemned to endure one of the most merciless punishments devised by human hands. It would be a public ordeal of prolonged agony, unfolding for hours beneath the relentless sun of Carthage's amphitheater, before the eyes of thousands eager for blood. Their tale is not solely a chronicle of terrible suffering. It stands as a quiet record of the steadfast endurance of the human will when placed before the most complete form of cruelty. Even today, when we think of ancient Rome, we think of grandeur, of mighty emperors like Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, of philosophical brilliance and architectural marvels. We think of gladiators fighting with honor, of senators debating with wisdom, of a society that valued justice and law above all else. But here's what they didn't want you to know, what they deliberately omitted from their carefully curated historical records. Rome was built on the systematic oppression and terrorization of half its population. Women in ancient Rome weren't just second-class citizens. They were essentially property with pulse, human beings whose entire existence was defined by their relationship to the men who owned them. And when they stepped out of line, when they dared to claim even a moment of personal agency or human desire, the punishments weren't just cruel. They were designed to be so horrifying that the mere whisper of them would keep every other woman in the empire paralyzed with fear. The woman at the center of our story had no name that survived in the official records, and that's exactly how Rome wanted it. She wasn't some peasant or slave. She was nobility, connected to one of the most prominent families in the empire. She had wealth, status, everything that should have provided protection in a society that claimed to value hierarchy and position. But when the accusation came, when the whispers started spreading through the marble halls of Roman high society, none of that mattered. Her crime? She was accused of adultery, not murder, not treason against the state, not theft or fraud or any of the things we might consider serious criminal offenses. She was accused of having intimate feelings for someone other than her husband. And for this, Rome buried her alive. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To truly understand the mind-numbing brutality of what happened to this woman, we need to dive deep into the twisted psychology of Roman society, particularly how it viewed and controlled women. Because this wasn't just about one woman's punishment. This was about creating a system of terror so complete, so all-encompassing, that no woman in the empire would ever dare step outside the suffocating boundaries that men had drawn around their lives. Roman society was built on two fundamental pillars, virtus and honor. Virtus, which we translate as virtue, was essentially the Roman ideal of excellence, of living up to the highest standards of Roman civilization. For men, virtus could be earned and demonstrated through military conquest, political achievement, philosophical wisdom, or legal brilliance. A Roman man could build his reputation, could rise through the ranks of society, could carve out his own destiny through his actions and achievements. Roman men had agency, had the ability to shape their own narrative and leave their mark on history. For women, virtus was something entirely different, something far more restrictive and infinitely more fragile. A Roman woman's virtue wasn't something she could build or achieve. It was something she could only preserve or lose. And once lost, it could never be regained. Female virtue in Rome was almost entirely centered around one concept: chastity. Not intelligence, not creativity, not kindness or wisdom, or any of the qualities we might associate with human virtue today. Just chastity, the ability to remain sexually pure, first for her father's family, then for her husband's lineage. This wasn't just a social expectation, it was literally written into Roman law. The legal status of Roman women was absolutely mind-boggling in its complete denial of basic human autonomy. Women were considered permanent property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. The legal terminology they used tells you everything you need to know about how Rome viewed women. Filia familiaris, when she was a daughter. Mater familiaris, when she became a mother. But never just familiaris. Never an individual in her own right. Roman law explicitly stated that women were incapable of making important decisions. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold political office, couldn't serve in the Senate, couldn't own property without male oversight, couldn't make legal contracts, couldn't represent themselves in court, couldn't even choose whom to marry. Every single aspect of a Roman woman's life required male approval and supervision. They lived in a legal framework that essentially declared them to be perpetual children, regardless of their age, intelligence, or capabilities. But here's where it gets even more sinister. The concept of patria potestas, the power of the father, gave Roman men absolute legal authority over their children, including adult daughters. This wasn't just about making science for minors. This was about maintaining complete control over grown women throughout their entire lives. A father could legally kill his adult daughter if he deemed her behavior inappropriate. He could force her into marriage, divorce her against her will, take away her children, confiscate any property she might have acquired, and even sell her into slavery if he chose. When a woman married, this absolute power simply transferred from father to husband. Roman marriage wasn't a partnership or even a love match. It was essentially a property transaction where one man handed control of his female property over to another man. The husband then had the same life and death authority over his wife that her father had previously held. He could divorce her for any reason or no reason at all, could take away her children, could restrict her movements, could monitor her every interaction, and could punish her physically for any perceived transgression. And what constituted a transgression? Literally anything that could be construed as threatening her chastity or the family's honor. Roman women were expected to live in a state of constant, hyper-vigilant self-monitoring. Every smile, every glance, every conversation, every movement outside the home was potentially dangerous. They were taught from childhood that their primary purpose was to serve as vessels for legitimate heirs, and that any behavior that could raise questions about their sexual purity was not just personally shameful, but potentially deadly. The concept of female chastity in Rome wasn't really about morality, in any sense we would recognize today. It was about property rights and political power. A woman's body was seen as the vessel through which a man's legitimate bloodline would continue. If there was any doubt about her chastity, it called into question the legitimacy of her children, which could affect inheritance rights, political alliances, and the transfer of wealth and power from one generation to the next. In a society where family lineage determined everything from social status to political connections to economic opportunities, female chastity became literally a matter of life and death. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and suspicion that would be absolutely suffocating to modern minds. Roman women lived under what can only be described as a reign of terror disguised as moral virtue. They were taught to fear not just actual impropriety, but the appearance of impropriety, the rumor of impropriety, even the possibility that someone might choose to spread false rumors about impropriety. Because in Rome's twisted legal system, the accusation was often enough to destroy a woman's life, regardless of the evidence. Roman society developed an entire infrastructure designed to monitor and control women's behavior. Slaves and servants were encouraged to report on their mistresses' activities. Neighbors watched neighbors, looking for any signs of suspicious behavior. Even family members were expected to police each other, with brothers, fathers, and husbands all serving as potential enforcers of the rigid moral code that governed women's lives. The psychological torture of this system cannot be overstated. Imagine living every single day knowing that any moment could bring an accusation that would destroy not just your life, but potentially the lives of your children and family members. Imagine the constant self-censorship, the eternal vigilance, the crushing weight of knowing that your very survival depended on the approval and protection of men who could withdraw that protection at any time for any reason. And yet, Roman propaganda painted this as virtue. They celebrated women who lived in silent obedience as the moral backbone of their civilization. They created myths and legends about heroic Roman women whose greatest achievements were suffering in silence, sacrificing themselves for male honor and dying rather than compromising their chastity. The ultimate Roman heroine wasn't a woman who achieved anything meaningful or contributed anything valuable to society. She was a woman who successfully preserved her sexual purity until death. This brings us to the story of our unnamed woman, whose fate was so horrific that it reveals the true nature of Roman civilization in all its brutal, hypocritical glory. She was born into privilege, into one of Rome's most prominent families. She had wealth, education, connections, everything that should have provided security and protection in Roman society. She lived in a beautiful home, wore fine clothes, had servants to attend to her needs, and was married to a man of appropriate social standing. To outside observers, she probably appeared to be living the ideal Roman life. But beneath the surface, she was trapped in the same suffocating cage that imprisoned all Roman women. Her days were spent in carefully orchestrated activities designed to display her virtue and enhance her family's reputation. She attended religious ceremonies, managed household affairs under her husband's supervision, and participated in the social rituals that maintained her family's position in Roman high society. Every aspect of her life was performed for an audience, every action measured against the impossible standards of Roman female virtue. And then came the accusation that would destroy everything. The specific details have been lost to history, deliberately erased, as we'll see. But the general nature of the charge was clear: adultery. Someone, somewhere, decided to accuse this woman of having violated her chastity vows. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was completely fabricated. Maybe it was somewhere in between. In Rome's legal system, it ultimately didn't matter. The accusation itself was enough to trigger a judicial process that was designed not to discover truth, but to reinforce the system of terror that kept all Roman women in line. The political implications of such accusations were enormous and often had nothing to do with the woman herself. In Rome's cutthroat political environment, attacking a man's female relatives was a common strategy for undermining his power and influence. If you could successfully accuse an enemy's wife, daughter, or sister of adultery, you could destroy his reputation, question the legitimacy of his heirs, and potentially ruin his entire family's political prospects for generations. There are hints in the historical record that our unnamed woman's alleged lover may have been connected to a rival political faction, which would have made her case as much about political warfare as personal morality. Augustus himself had passed laws, the Lex Julia de Adulterius, that made adultery a criminal offense punishable by exile or death, giving the state official power to intervene in what had previously been considered private family matters. These laws weren't really about protecting marriage or family values. They were about giving the Roman government another tool for controlling and manipulating the population. The decision to erase this woman's name from the historical record was calculated and deliberate. This wasn't an oversight or an accident of historical preservation. This was damnatio memoriae, the official practice of removing someone's name and image from all public records as a form of punishment that extended beyond death. But unlike typical cases of damnatio memoriae, which were designed to erase the memory of political enemies or disgraced leaders, this erasure served a different purpose. Rome wanted this woman's story to survive, but only as an anonymous warning. They wanted every other woman in the empire to know what had happened, but they didn't want to create a martyr or a symbol of resistance. By keeping her nameless, Rome ensured that her story would be told in whispers, passed down from mother to daughter as a cautionary tale rather than remembered as the tragedy of a specific individual who deserved compassion or justice. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, creating a legend of terror that would influence behavior while remaining vague enough to apply to any woman who might be tempted to step outside the boundaries of acceptable conduct. The trial that sealed her fate was a masterpiece of Roman hypocrisy, a legal proceeding that maintained all the appearances of justice while delivering a predetermined outcome designed to terrorize the female population. Roman law, which the empire celebrated as one of its greatest achievements, prided itself on principles like the right to defense, the presumption of innocence, and the requirement for evidence-based judgment. These principles were regularly applied when the accused was a male Roman citizen of good standing. But for women, especially in cases involving adultery or violations of chastity, the legal system operated under entirely different rules. The trial was conducted privately, away from the public forums where male citizens could expect their cases to be heard openly. Instead of being judged by a jury of peers or by elected officials accountable to the public, she faced a panel of male judges who had been specifically chosen for their commitment to upholding traditional Roman values regarding female behavior. The evidence presented against her was exactly the kind of material that would be laughed out of court in a case involving a male defendant. Rumors, whispers, gossip, and testimony from slaves who may have been tortured to produce the desired statements. Roman law explicitly recognized that slave testimony was unreliable because it was often obtained through torture. But in cases involving female chastity, these legal safeguards were conveniently ignored or set aside. The woman herself had virtually no ability to mount an effective defense. She couldn't call witnesses without her male guardian's permission, couldn't cross-examine her accusers, couldn't present evidence that might contradict the charges, and couldn't even speak in her own defense without male supervision. Her words carried no legal weight when contradicted by men of standing, regardless of their credibility or motives. The entire proceeding was designed to appear legitimate while ensuring that only one outcome was possible. The judges weren't really there to weigh evidence or determine truth. They were there to provide a veneer of legal respectability to what was essentially a public execution designed to terrorize other women. The trial served as both punishment and advertisement, a carefully orchestrated spectacle that would be talked about in private conversations throughout the empire for generations to come. Roman courts prided themselves on their sophisticated legal procedures, their careful attention to precedent and evidence, their commitment to justice and fairness. But all of these noble principles evaporated when applied to women accused of sexual impropriety. The same legal system that would spend weeks carefully evaluating evidence in a property dispute between male citizens would condemn a woman to death based on little more than malicious gossip and tortured slave testimony. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so obvious, that it could only be maintained through willful blindness and collective participation in the fiction that women were somehow different, somehow less deserving of legal protection, somehow inherently less trustworthy and more in need of control. Roman legal scholars wrote extensively about principles of justice and fairness that they would never dream of applying to half the population they governed. And then came the sentence that would reveal the true depths of Roman cruelty. Viva sepultura. Live burial. She would be sealed alive in a subterranean chamber and left to die slowly of starvation, dehydration, and suffocation. This wasn't just execution. This was torture, designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the legal fiction that the Roman state wasn't directly shedding blood. The Romans were obsessed with technicalities when it came to certain types of killing. They believed that some forms of execution were more civilized, more legally acceptable than others. Direct execution by sword or axe was considered too crude, too obviously violent for certain classes of people. So they developed elaborate methods of killing that allowed them to claim they weren't really committing murder. They were simply removing someone from society and allowing nature to take its course. Live burial had traditionally been reserved for Vestal virgins who were accused of breaking their vows of chastity. The Vestals were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, who were required to maintain their virginity for the entire duration of their service. The penalty for a Vestal virgin who was found guilty of unchastity was to be buried alive in a specially constructed underground chamber. The Romans justified this horrific punishment by claiming that since the Vestals were sacred to the goddess, their blood could not be shed directly, so instead they would be sealed underground with a small amount of food and water and left to die slowly in complete darkness and isolation. The fact that our unnamed woman received the same punishment traditionally reserved for Vestal virgins tells us something crucial about how seriously Rome took her alleged crime. This wasn't just about punishing adultery. This was about sending a message that would echo through the empire for generations. The punishment was designed to be so horrific, so utterly beyond the bounds of human decency, that it would serve as the ultimate deterrent to any woman who might be tempted to claim any form of personal autonomy or sexual agency. The chamber where she would die was specially constructed for the occasion. Roman engineers, the same brilliant minds that built the aqueducts and roads that we still admire today, designed and built a tomb for a living person. The chamber was deep underground, accessible only through a narrow opening that would be sealed with heavy stones once she was inside. The walls were thick stone or brick, designed to muffle any sounds she might make as she slowly died. Inside this underground tomb, the Romans placed token amounts of food and water, not enough to sustain life for more than a few days, but enough to create the legal fiction that they were not directly causing her death. They also provided a single oil lamp that would burn until its fuel was depleted, after which she would be left in complete and absolute darkness. These provisions weren't acts of mercy. They were calculated elements of psychological torture, brief reprieves that would make the inevitable end even more terrifying. The psychological horror of this punishment is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine being sealed alive in a stone chamber barely large enough to stand or lie down in, knowing that no rescue is possible, no reprieve will come, and no one will even remember your name. The isolation would be complete and absolute. No human voice, no natural light, no fresh air, no hope of escape or rescue. As the oil in the lamp slowly burned away, the darkness would gradually close in, making the chamber feel even smaller and more suffocating. The physical suffering would be prolonged and agonizing. Death by starvation and dehydration is a slow process that can take weeks, during which the victim experiences increasing weakness, disorientation, and pain. The lack of fresh air would create a feeling of constant suffocation, while the cold stone walls and floor would make sleep difficult or impossible. Every moment would bring fresh awareness of the hopelessness of the situation, the absolute certainty of a prolonged and agonizing death. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this punishment was its deliberate design to erase the victim from human memory while keeping her story alive as a tool of terror. Unlike execution by sword or crucifixion, which would leave a body to be buried and mourned, live burial left nothing behind. There would be no grave, no marker, no physical reminder that this person had ever existed. Her death would be as invisible as her life had been constrained, witnessed by no one and remembered by none. The Romans made sure that the location of her tomb was kept secret, known only to a few officials who would take that knowledge to their own graves. This wasn't just about preventing rescue attempts. This was about ensuring that future generations would never be able to find her remains, never be able to honor her memory, never be able to transform her story from a cautionary tale into a symbol of resistance or martyrdom. The message to other Roman women was crystal clear and utterly terrifying. Your wealth, your status, your family connections, your innocence, none of these things can protect you if the wrong accusation is made at the wrong time. Your survival depends entirely on the favor and protection of the men who control your life, and that protection can be withdrawn at any moment for any reason. Step outside the boundaries we have drawn around your existence, and you will not just die. You will be erased from human memory as if you had never existed at all. The deliberate erasure of this woman's name from official records was one of the most sophisticated acts of psychological warfare in human history. By keeping her anonymous, Rome ensured that her story would function as a universal threat rather than a specific historical event. Every woman in the empire could imagine herself in that underground chamber, could picture her own family abandoning her, could visualize her own name being struck from the records and her own memory disappearing into the darkness. The stories were passed down in whispers from mother to daughter, shared in hushed conversations between women who understood that they lived under a constant threat of similar punishment. These weren't bedtime stories or moral lessons. These were survival guides, warnings about the deadly consequences of stepping outside the narrow boundaries that Roman society had drawn around women's lives. Roman mothers would take their daughters aside and explain in terrified whispers that beauty was dangerous, that intelligence was suspect, that any sign of independence or personal agency could be fatal. They would describe the underground chamber, the slow death by starvation, the complete erasure from human memory, all in the hope that this knowledge would keep their daughters safe by keeping them terrified and compliant. The genius of this system was that it didn't require constant enforcement through visible violence. The Romans didn't need to execute women publicly on a regular basis, didn't need to maintain a visible apparatus of oppression, didn't need to constantly remind women of their powerlessness. The whispered stories did all of that work for them, creating a self-sustaining system of fear that was far more effective than any amount of visible coercion could have been. Every Roman woman lived with the knowledge that she was always one accusation, one rumor, one political miscalculation away from complete destruction. This knowledge shaped every decision, influenced every interaction, determined every aspect of their daily lives. They learned to move through the world like shadows, to speak in whispers, to avoid anything that might draw attention or create suspicion. The state justified this reign of terror through elaborate moral and philosophical arguments about the importance of female virtue to the stability of Roman civilization. They claimed that by controlling women's sexuality, they were protecting the integrity of family lineages, preserving the legitimacy of inheritance rights, and maintaining the social order that made Roman greatness possible. But the reality was simpler and far more cynical. This wasn't about protecting Roman virtue or preserving family values. This was about maintaining absolute control over half the population through systematic terrorization. Roman men understood that their own power and privilege depended on keeping women in a state of constant fear and dependency. If women were allowed to claim even basic human autonomy, if they were permitted to make their own choices about their bodies and their lives, the entire structure of Roman society would begin to crumble. The unnamed woman's story was just one thread in a vast tapestry of oppression that touched every aspect of Roman life. Historical records hint at similar punishments inflicted on other women whose names have also been deliberately erased from history. These weren't isolated incidents or aberrations. They were part of a systematic campaign to terrorize women into complete submission. Roman historians and legal scholars wrote extensively about justice, virtue, and the proper ordering of society, but they were careful to avoid dwelling on the details of how that order was actually maintained. The stories of women buried alive, of families destroyed by false accusations, of lives ruined by malicious gossip, were deliberately omitted from the official historical record. Rome wanted to be remembered for its achievements in law, architecture, literature, and military conquest, not for its systematic brutalization of women. But these stories survived anyway, passed down through underground networks of women who understood that their survival depended on knowing the full extent of the dangers they faced. They created their own oral history, their own system of knowledge preservation, their own methods of ensuring that the truth would survive even when it was officially suppressed. The legacy of our unnamed woman extends far beyond her individual tragedy. Her story became part of the collective memory of Roman women, a shared understanding of the price of resistance and the cost of claiming personal agency. Every generation of Roman women grew up knowing her story, learning from her fate, understanding that their own survival depended on never repeating whatever choices had led to her destruction. This system of control through terrorization was so effective that it outlasted the empire itself. The basic structure of female oppression that Rome perfected, the legal powerlessness, the economic dependency, the social surveillance, the threat of violent punishment for sexual autonomy, became the template for patriarchal control throughout Western civilization. The specific methods evolved and changed over time, but the underlying principles remained remarkably consistent for centuries after Rome fell. Rome's greatest achievement, according to its own propaganda, was the creation of a stable, orderly civilization that brought peace and prosperity to the known world. Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman administration, Roman military organization, all of these were celebrated as pinnacles of human achievement that lifted humanity out of barbarism and chaos. But the true foundation of Roman order wasn't law or engineering or military might, it was terror. Specifically, it was the systematic terrorization of women to such a degree that they would never dare challenge the system that oppressed them. Rome sustained itself not through the consent of the governed, but through the careful cultivation of fear so complete and so pervasive that resistance became literally unthinkable. The unnamed woman sealed in her underground tomb wasn't just a victim of Roman cruelty. She was a sacrifice on the altar of Roman civilization itself. Her slow death in darkness and isolation was the price that Rome extracted for the stability and order that it celebrated as its greatest achievement. Every marble temple, every aqueduct, every road, every legal code was built on a foundation of stories like hers. Stories of women who paid the ultimate price for daring to claim the basic human dignity that Roman men took for granted. The ultimate cruelty of her fate wasn't just the physical suffering of live burial, horrific as that was. The ultimate cruelty was the erasure of her memory, the deliberate destruction of her identity, the transformation of her individual human tragedy into an anonymous tool of terror. She died twice, once in the underground chamber, slowly and alone, and again when her name was struck from the records and her humanity was reduced to a cautionary tale. But in a strange way, her anonymous legacy became more powerful than any named martyrdom could have been. Because she had no name, she could be any woman. Because her specific identity was erased, every Roman woman could see herself in her story. Because she became a universal symbol rather than an individual victim, her warning echoed through generations in ways that a specific historical account might not have. Her story reveals the fundamental lie at the heart of Roman civilization, the claim that it represented the triumph of law and order over chaos and barbarism. Rome wasn't more civilized than the societies it conquered. It was simply more sophisticated in its methods of control and oppression. The same empire that built aqueducts to bring fresh water to its cities also built underground tombs for living women. The same legal system that created principles of justice that we still admire today also created mechanisms for condemning women to death based on gossip and rumor. The marble facades and triumphal arches that tourists admire today were designed to hide this darker reality, to present a vision of Roman greatness that carefully omitted the systematic brutalization that made that greatness possible. Rome succeeded in creating the historical narrative it wanted. We remember it as a pinnacle of civilization, a source of law and order and cultural achievement. But beneath that carefully constructed image lies a foundation of bones, and many of those bones belong to women whose names were deliberately erased from history. As we stand in the ruins of the Roman Forum today, walking through the remains of temples and basilicas, where Roman men debated philosophy and crafted legal codes, it's important to remember that somewhere beneath our feet lie the remains of underground chambers, where women died slowly in darkness for the crime of claiming basic human agency. The same civilization that created the Pantheon and the Colosseum also created those hidden tombs, and both are equally representative of what Rome really was. The unnamed woman's story is a reminder that history is written by the victors, and that the victors are usually those with the power to control the narrative. Rome's version of its own story emphasized law, order, military conquest, architectural achievement, and cultural refinement. The stories of the women it terrorized, imprisoned, and buried alive were deliberately omitted from that official narrative, preserved only in whispers and warnings passed down through unofficial channels. But those whispered stories are just as much a part of Roman history as the marble columns and bronze statues that survive in museums today. The underground chambers where women died are just as representative of Roman civilization as the libraries and law courts where men debated and governed. The fear that permeated women's daily lives was just as much a part of Roman society as the military parades and gladiatorial games that celebrated Roman power. Her silent echo across the centuries reminds us that every civilization, no matter how glorious its achievements or noble its ideals, must be judged not only by how it treated its most privileged citizens, but by how it treated its most vulnerable. Rome failed that test catastrophically, and the unnamed woman sealed in her underground tomb stands as eternal testimony to that failure. In the end, her story is not just about ancient history. It's about the price of progress built on oppression, the cost of order maintained through terror, and the human capacity for cruelty disguised as virtue. It's a reminder that the greatest civilizations in history often achieved their greatness through the systematic brutalization of those least able to resist, and that the marble monuments we admire today may be built on foundations of suffering that their creators were careful to hide from history. The worst punishment ever inflicted on a woman in ancient Rome wasn't just the live burial itself, horrific as that was. It was the complete erasure of her humanity, the transformation of her individual tragedy into a tool of collective terrorization, and the centuries of silence that followed. She died, not just as a person, but as a symbol, and her anonymous suffering became the foundation upon which Roman civilization built its golden age of art, literature, law, and empire.